How complicit are Muslim leaders around the world in terms of what's happening in Palestine?
The genocide could not have proceeded and would not proceed today if Muslims were not complicit.
What do you mean by that, Khaled? How do we change the way we read the Quran?
The most important thing about thinking about God's will for us on this earth is not whether women should cover their hair. What are we going to do with universal human rights, universal dignity?
Donald Trump won a large share of the Muslim vote in last year's presidential election. He increased his Muslim vote share.
A Christian America will have no place for Muslims. If you understood the Trump administration, your naturalized American citizenship will not protect you.
Do you agree with me, Khaled, that Islamophobia right now in the US is much worse than it was even after 9/11?
They're talking very openly about, oh, we can't wait till we start gassing people. And they're talking about Muslims.
Since the launch of Zeteo, we've covered the stories of Palestinians from several perspectives: humanitarian, political, geopolitical, personal, and more. My next guest, however, wants to discuss the issue from a different viewpoint, a theological one. Khaled Abou El Fadl is a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles. He's also one of the West's leading Muslim thinkers, an expert in both the Islamic and Western intellectual traditions. For years now, long before the genocide began, Abou El Fadl has been talking about the plight of Palestinians in the form of sermons and public addresses from an Islamic point of view, merging faith and politics as he sheds light on Israel's threats against not just Palestinians, but Muslims as a whole. People around the world can now read those sermons by picking up a copy of the professor's latest book. It's called the Palestine Sermons. In it are 25 sermons and one public address that Abou El Fadl delivered between April 2018 and May 2024 in response to the ongoing developments relating to Israel and Palestine. So, joining me now remotely from Columbus, Ohio, is the author, professor, and scholar himself, Khaled Abou El Fadl. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, my pleasure.
We've interviewed, Khaled, several authors who wrote books on Gaza and Palestine on this show. Arab authors, Jewish authors, Palestinian authors, you name it. And your book is very different from theirs in the sense that it discusses Israel-Palestine from an Islamic point of view. A lot of people, Khaled, you know this, including a lot of Muslims, would say Israel-Palestine should not be treated as a religious issue. It should be treated only as a political issue, a legal issue, a human rights issue. It's not a religious issue or a religious war. What do you say to them?
Well, any Muslim has ingrained with them Islamic normativities, especially those Muslims who are committed to their tradition. And you can't extract Islamic normativities from the realm of what they see as right or wrong. That's one. But the second issue, and it's really important, is that know that Zionism and Israel privileges a particular version of history and a particular version of theology. It adopts the narrative of a promised land as true to the exclusion of all others. And it just happens to be that part of that exclusion is the Islamic narrative. So as a Muslim, I have no choice but to engage the Israeli narrative on its own terms.
It's interesting that just the other day, Bill Maher, a very famous atheist, went out of his way to say the Bible guarantees the land to the Jews, that the Israeli narrative is guaranteed by the Bible, a book he doesn't believe in. You say in the book, Gaza is a watershed moment. Everything has to change. The way we read the Quran has to change. The way we relate to one another has to change. What is happening in Gaza and our powerlessness is a direct lesson from God. What do you mean by that, Khaled? How do we change the way we read the Quran?
For me, because I'm also a professor of human rights, and most of my life, I've worked in the human rights field with Human Rights Watch and other organizations. And for me, Gaza, let's take a step back and say that the narrative, post-colonial narrative, has been that colonialism has come to an end. This is the narrative presented to Muslims. Colonialism has come to an end. Now we have a new world order after colonialism, and the new world order is premised on rules of law in the international field, in the international order, And part of the rules of law is rules of human rights, and including the right to self-determination. Now, Muslims are presented with this moment, which it's a watershed moment, which they have to really think whether rules of international law continue to exist after Gaza, whether in fact they claim that post-colonialism has transcended its racist origins is true, and critically, the place of human rights. As a Muslim theologian and as a Muslim jurist, for me, and to put it very bluntly, it is the most important thing about thinking about God's will for us on this earth is not whether women should cover their hair or whether Muslims should perfect their wudu. These seem to be truly marginal issues compared to the critical issue of the trajectory of humanity. What are we going to do with universal human rights, universal dignity, the right to self-determination? Indeed, the concept of all-out war in which, as I say in the book, rules of war were not invented because you like who you fight. It is because you hate who you fight. They were not invented because you are fighting good people. They were invented because you are fighting people you think of as wicked. And that's a watershed moment, and a very critical moment, I think, that challenges all Muslim theologians and all Muslim jurists.
Liking this video? Then don't just watch, hit like, share and subscribe. And tap the bell so you never miss a video or live show. But if you want early access to exclusive content, then you have to head to zeteo.com and subscribe now. You'll be supporting fearless, independent journalism. And I want to come back to kind of what challenges Muslims. But you mentioned colonialism a moment ago. You often draw parallels in your sermons between the ongoing extermination of Palestinians by Israel and the extermination of Native Americans by European settlers, colonialists. You say this is not really about Islam, nor is it about Israel. So is it all about race then? Is it about native people being exterminated?
I truly believe so, because for one thing, if you follow Israeli media, and I'm sure you do, the number of times in which Israelis say, well, why is what we're doing so bad? Why would the West condemn us for the genocide when the West has genocided countless indigenous peoples, and especially with the United States? The parallel is often drawn with what the United States did with indigenous Americans. And there's another point, and that is why at a cultural level did the United States sympathize so much with Israelis despite the history of anti-Semitism? And I would submit, and I would argue, that Israel presented an example of what colonialism has done to indigenous people all over, including what the United States have done to indigenous Americans. And so it seemed familiar. You go to a land, you claim you discovered this land, you say that the people who live there don't really count because whatever claims you have about their culture, that they don't see property in the same way, they don't see values in the same way, and you proceed to exterminate them and replace them. That is remarkably familiar, and you cannot get away with it without a racially based understanding of values and of right and wrong.
In your sermon in the book titled A Manipulation of Muslim Consciousness and the Art of Subordination, you say the real disaster is when the theology of the colonizer is superimposed upon the colonized, so that Muslims themselves buy into the idea that what happens in Makkah is a Saudi concern and what happens in Al-Aqsa is a Palestinian concern. In your view, Khaled, how complicit are Muslim leaders around the world in terms of what's happening in Palestine, in terms of abandoning the Palestinians for their own self-interest?
You know, the genocide could not have happened. And let's be very frank about this. The genocide could not have proceeded and would not proceed today if Muslims were not complicit. The role of the United Arab Emirates in covering for Israel and continuing to supply Israel, the role of Jordan in making sure that goods continue to flow into Israel, the role of Egypt in suffocating and laying siege to the Palestinians and helping Israel with this, the role of Saudi Arabia in continuing to talk about the Abraham Accords and the possibilities of peace and the Neom Project and funding Trump, giving him billions and billions of dollars. There is no, and I believe that Israel understands this quite well. And that is why Israel, quite frankly, doesn't see any cost to reneging on its agreements with Palestinians. Israel has annexed so far about 80% of the West Bank, has taken over all of Gaza. It is quite true when you hear from, because I follow Israeli media quite closely, and when Israelis talk about, Arabs want us to finish off Hamas for them, Arabs just want us to do the job for them. I think there's a lot of truth to that.
We live in a time, Khaled, where you say in one of your sermons, tyrannical Muslim rulers cannot be held accountable by their people for their treachery and immorality. Are you of the view that we are, I don't know, as a result of Gaza, any close to seeing a repeat of the Arab Spring, for example, of people actually turning on the rule, or is that just a pipe dream?
That's a really hard question. I know from, as a student of history, that one rule of history is that when the state applies overwhelming coercion and force, what the state does, it postpones its crisis of legitimacy. It doesn't solve it. And so history teaches that what governments such as the government in Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, they are postponing the inevitable. And the inevitable is that their masses will once again rise against them, because only among the very small elite are they legitimate. But among the masses, no one sees these governments as having any legitimacy, because they act with impunity and incomplete. They completely ignore the will of their own people, and frankly, they simply will not hold themselves accountable to the people they rule over. That's an unsustainable situation, and I think Israel and the United States are being simply thick-headed and rather stupid for, instead of winning hearts and minds of the masses of the region and saying, we have to live here, let's find a way to peacefully coexist, they continue saying, well, we'll deal with corrupt rulers and ignore the masses. But that just is not sustainable. I don't see how it's sustainable.
Let's talk about Islam and Muslim here in the United States, where you have lived and worked and taught for decades. Donald Trump won a large share of the Muslim vote in last year's presidential election. According to ISPU, 31% of American Muslims voted for Donald Trump, higher than the proportion that voted for him in 2020. He increased his Muslim vote share. In the Arab American majority city of Dearborn, Trump beat Harris 42.5% to 36%, I think, according to CARE's polling. You've said in one sermon, quote, there are influential Muslims in the United States who have taken the bizarre position of supporting or even working with the Trump administration as if this is somehow consistent with their Islamic ethics and morality. Unpack for us what you mean by that.
Well, we all know, we all remember the Muslim ban, and we all remember the Supreme Court decision in which the dissenting opinion goes into excruciating detail of how much Islamophobic discourse was generated by the Trump administration. We all know that the Trump administration, even today, relies on Islamophobes, well-known Islamophobes like Stephen Miller, who has views that are quite extreme. Now, how do you, so there is someone who says, I work with those who hate you. How do you ignore that and say, well, I'm going to embrace you and open my arms towards you anyway? Now, with Muslims, there are two parts about the Trump vote, the Muslims who voted for Trump. A segment of these Muslims were completely disgusted by the Biden administration and its
Yes.
blessing of the genocide. So that part we know. And so in many ways, it was a protest vote. But there is another segment which is, and this is part of why I say after Gaza, everything has to change, which myopically believes that because the Trump administration is anti-LGBTQ, that the Trump administration upholds is anti-abortion, and in other words, values that they think of as Islamic, that they will have a share in the table. That this more conservative administration, which will combat homosexuality and combat abortion, is closer to what they see as Islamicity. And in my view, that is remarkably myopic, because a Christian America will have no place for Muslims. I mean, you might like their stand, which I don't, on LGBTQ and abortion and so on, but they have no place for you. And that is part of what has to change. When I go to Muslim centers or Muslim spaces, Islamic centers and so on, and they are happy that that they're happy about an anti-pornography discourse on part of some Trump appointee, and I look at them and I quite bluntly put it to them. Well, do you know you can take your happiness and ICE will show up and arrest you and throw you in some detention center? And your American citizenship, if you understood the Trump administration, your naturalized American citizenship will not protect you, because the law is broad enough to denaturalize U.S. citizens if you accuse them of supporting anti-Semitism, supporting terrorism, or being anti-Semites or whatever.
I think you're right about the Christian America having no place for Muslim America. Christian nationalist America, we should say. I've had the last 24, 48 hours, I've had Christian nationalists telling me that I need to leave the country because there's no place for Islam or Muslims in America, literally the last 24 hours online. So it's happening openly. Do you agree with me, Khaled, that Islamophobia right now in the US is much worse than it was even after 9/11?
Absolutely. I mean, you saw the leaks of the new Republicans. I mean, to be honest with you, I was when I was a young man at Yale, I was a student of a great professor called Yuan Lins. Yuan Lins studied, he was a Spanish professor, a long time a Yale professor, who studied how democracies deteriorate into fascist regimes. That was his specialty. And I studied with this man for years. And when I read the leaks by the young Republicans, chills were going up and down my spine. They're talking very openly about, oh, we can't wait till we start gassing people. Well, they're not, even when they don't say it explicitly, although some did, they're talking about Muslims. The people, you think they're going to gas homosexuals, but they're going to exempt Muslims? Are you insane? But from as an Muslim theologian, and I want to make this very clear, that for Muslims, even if they would exempt Muslims, no decent moral Muslim would stand for the type of ill will they have towards homosexuals or towards any minority. That's the nature of morality. It either covers us all or it doesn't exist.
Well said. You say, you talk about Zionism and Islamophobia. We talked about Christian nationalism as a driving force of Islamophobia. What about the relationship between Zionism and Islamophobia? Do you believe that the dehumanization of the Palestinians has paved the way for the dehumanization of Muslims as a whole?
You know, I remember a long time ago, before the explosion of Islamophobia, a figure that I'm sure you know, Daniel Pipes.
Yes.
And back then, when he wrote his rather infamous article, the Muslims are coming. And before Islamophobia became a Christian nationalist cause. It was a Zionist cause, and you couldn't separate the roots of Islamophobia from those who believed that in order for Israel to be safe, we need to demonize Islam in where Islam was making inroads in the West. And figures like Daniel Pipes were quite prominent in that. But Daniel Pipes and his article, The Muslims Are Coming, seem meek by comparison to what we read today. I just watched, it was on YouTube, a MAGA woman, I forgot her name, who just made a series of videos about how jihad is going to overtake America. And Islamophobia is a perfect distraction tool to get those Americans who might otherwise be worried about what a Christian America would look like to focus on the Islamic boogie.
I think it was Toni Morrison who once said the basic function of racism is distraction. Last question to you, Khaled. There are a lot of hard and grim truths in your sermons. But when you look at the Muslim majority world right now, when you look at Muslim communities across the US and the West right now, where do you see hope? Where do you see the potential for positive change?
That's a really good question. And, honestly, I really do, because I lived through the Arab Spring. I was in Egypt at the time. And I saw how in an instant Islam and democratic values and human rights values were the most natural thing. I mean, there were masses and people treated each other. And in fact, even Israel, the way it reacted to to what it saw as the unpredictability or the instability of democracy in a country like Egypt. Israel changed its tone. So I see hope in hopefully the masses rising again and demanding the right to self-determination and the right to have governments that are accountable to them. That's the only hope that I can possibly see, because otherwise the messianic government of Netanyahu is working towards a greater Israel. I think there's very little doubt about that. And a greater Israel means that it will be the only superpower in the region. And the only superpower in the region will mean years of subjugation and dictatorship for Muslims indefinitely.
Khaled Abou El Fadl, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. The book is called The Palestine Sermons. Appreciate you taking time out for us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.